Count them. Count the Primarchs. The Imperium will help you. There are statues, there are records, there are 10,000 years of Imperial history built around the number. You will count the first, Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels. You will count Fulgrim, the third, Perturabo, the fourth. You will count all the way to the 20th, Alpharius Omegon of the Alpha Legion. And twice, at the 2nd and at the 11th, you will find nothing. Not a grave. Not a name struck through. Nothing. A gap the exact shape of a sun, with the Imperium standing in front of it, insisting there is no gap at all. The official position is that both were expunged, every record removed, every monument struck. By the Emperor's direct order, under what the lore calls the Edict of Obliteration, the condemnation of memory, for reasons the Emperor took with him to the Golden Throne.
By the time of the Horus Heresy, the plinths that once held their statues in the Imperial Palace had been vacant for so long that the novel Betrayal simply counts 18 legions at Monarchia, not 20. Both were already gone. The lore describes the result as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in Imperial history. That phrase deserves attention. Not simply successful, the most successful. Among all the things the Imperium has ever erased, and it has erased entire worlds, entire peoples, entire campaigns, these two erasures are the ones that held. Aaron Dembski-Bowden's novel The First Heretic gives us the only direct in-universe acknowledgement that survives. A character discussing the 11th states simply, is expunged from Imperial record for good reason, as is the second. Nothing more. The surviving Primarchs swore an oath never to speak of them again.
Malcador the Sigillite. When Rogel Dorn pressed him on the loyalist support of 2 unaccounted legions during the heresy, answered with 4 words, "They are lost to us forever." The novel Deliverance Lost records the Emperor telling Corax there are 17 other Primarchs, not 19. Both were gone before Corax was even found. The Horus Heresy, Book 1, Betrayal states it plainly. Save 2 whose secrets are far beyond this record, each was sooner or later placed in command of one of the Emperor's Space Marine legions. 2 whose secrets are beyond the record, not lost, beyond. Then, the First Heretic offers one final detail. It refers to the 2 lost Primarchs by a pair of designations, one, the Forgotten, the other, the Purged. 2 erasures, 2 different names, suggesting 2 different fates. The Purged implies active removal, judgment, disgrace, something done. The Forgotten implies something else, something the record itself couldn't hold on to.
That asymmetry is where this reconstruction starts. There are 2 lost Primarchs, and this script concerns one of them. Specifically, it concerns the forensic argument. Not settled canon, but a forensic argument assembled from canonical pieces, that one of the 2 was a psychic null. Not a psyker. Not a Primarch who fell to chaos. The opposite of all of that. A being whose nature suppressed the warp rather than channeling it. A living blank. And the argument that rather than being destroyed, that son's gene line was taken apart and placed inside 2 institutions the Imperium has operated ever since, in plain sight, wearing 2 different uniforms for 10,000 years. To understand why that argument exists, you first need to understand what a null actually is. Across the Imperium's documentation, the condition carries several names: blank, untouchable, pariah.
The Sisters of Silence wiki describes it as a rare mutation, sometimes inaccurately described as the pariah gene. Inaccurately because it isn't a single identifiable gene, but a complex condition producing something extraordinary in the human population. Approximately 1 in a billion humans carries it. Most worlds won't produce a single carrier in an entire generation. Some estimates place the frequency even lower. What the gene does is this. A normal human casts a presence in the immaterium, the warp, the psychic ocean underlying material reality. Psychers cast a blazing one. Even baseline humans leave a flicker, a soul shadow marking their existence in the warp's collective memory. A blank has none. Where a soul shadow should be, there is nothing, or something less than nothing, a negative imprint, an absence that registers as a wound rather than a vacancy.
The Sisters of Silence Codex captures the mechanism precisely. A blank's mind can actually sever the connection between the warp and real space within their local area. Not suppress it, sever it. Their presence creates a zone the warp can't perceive. Demons experience this as something the Lexicanum describes as nigh unbearable. Their existence depends on warp connectivity to real space, and a blank disrupts that connection at its foundation. Psychers experience it as panic attacks, seizures, the sensation of suffocation. Even ordinary humans with no psychic ability feel it. A crawling wrongness, a directional panic the body generates before the mind can understand why. The stronger expressions of this aura, those found in the Sisters who become Oblivion Knights, are described in the Sisters of Silence wiki as howling abysses of darkness. Not simply an absence, an active interference, a null field that makes psychic power hazardous to attempt in the vicinity.
There is a 34th millennium record in the 3rd edition Codex Assassins. A farseer named the Thandros Esmenthil, who could read the skeins of fate, was sent to deal with a cullexus assassin. He scryed the future to locate his pursuer's thread, and found nothing. No thread, no trace. A being with no warp presence doesn't register in a discipline built entirely on warp perception. The farseer was driven to exhaustion searching for something that the warp itself couldn't see. The cullexus simply walked up to him. That is what a null does. It doesn't fight the warp. It renders the warp blind. Now the canon includes one line that bears directly on whether a Primarch could carry this gene. The Sisters of Silence wiki states that no Space Marine or Custodian Guard has ever been recorded as being a psychic null. The reason is structural. Space Marine gene seed derives from the Emperor, the most powerful psyker in human history, through the Primarch lineage.
Every Geneseed implant carries a sliver of the Emperor's own psychic nature. The pariah gene, which severs the warp connection entirely, would be wholly an anathema to that inheritance, and would likely simply kill its implanted subject. Then the text adds, "It can only be speculated that if even a single legion of psychic null legiones Astartes had been possible, how very different history may well have been." That sentence is phrased as a counterfactual, an impossibility. The canon treats a null Space Marine legion as something that could never exist. And that is precisely where the forensic argument begins. Because if a Primarch carried the pariah gene at a warp-significant scale, he couldn't have a standard legion. His sons couldn't receive the standard Geneseed. His biological inheritance would have to go somewhere the Emperor's psychic imprint wouldn't poison the result. Not a legion built from implanted boys. An order built from natural carriers. Rare individuals born with the null condition, gathered rather than manufactured. One thing needs stating plainly before the argument proceeds. What follows is reconstruction, not revelation. No codex, no novel, no Games Workshop statement confirms any Primarch as a null.
The Warhammer 40,000 wiki notes explicitly that the Null Primarch concept appears to be fan speculation rather than established canon. That assessment is accurate, and this script won't pretend otherwise. The argument here is assembled from canonical pieces arranged into a coherent explanation, honest reconstruction, not fact. Confidence levels will be given where relevant. A 15 to 25% probability that one of the two lost Primarchs was a psychic null. A 10 to 20% probability that his gene line was deliberately distributed. Those are calibrated assessments based on canonical evidence, not certainties dressed as mysteries.
With that said, the forensic case. The two designations, the Forgotten and the Purged, imply different mechanisms of erasure. The Purged implies active judgment. The Forgotten implies something the record itself struggled to retain. The mechanism of the expungement matters here. The Edict of Obliteration is described as the most successful in Imperial history. That is a remarkable claim for an institution that erases things routinely. Institutional will explains most of it. The Emperor personally ordered it. Surviving Primarchs swore oaths, and the apparatus of the Imperium was turned toward the task. But for the Forgotten specifically, the argument proposes an additional mechanism. The warp has memory. Primarchs, described in the canon as beings of the warp, merely clad in flesh, whose souls burn with a presence visible across the immaterium, would leave enormous psychic echoes after death. Erasing a Primarch from physical records is achievable.
Erasing him from demonic recollection, from the psychic residue that persists in the warp long after every physical monument is destroyed, that is a different problem, one that would make complete erasure extremely difficult for most Primarchs. A Null Primarch would have no such residue. No warp presence means no psychic echo. The warp wouldn't remember him not because the memory was destroyed, but because it was never formed. The most successful Edict of Obliteration in Imperial history is most plausible. Not certain, but more plausible, for the one son the warp itself had never recorded. Then there is the Genocide incompatibility, which is simultaneously the argument's strongest obstacle and its strongest supporting piece. The canon confirms no null space marines exist and gives a structural reason why. The Emperor's psychic imprint is carried in Genocide, making the pariah gene incompatible at the point of implantation.
A Primarch with the pariah gene couldn't produce standard Astartes. He would have no viable legion in the conventional sense. His biological contribution would have to take an entirely different shape. Natural carriers, gathered rather than manufactured, an order rather than a legion. The canon then provides, completely independently, two institutions built entirely on natural pariah carriers. Both trace their origins to the early Great Crusade, the same period as the lost Primarch's discovery, service, and erasure. Both were kept, by the Emperor's direct authority, under operational secrecy that exceeds even the Imperium's usual standards. And one specific detail in the canon is worth noting. The Emperor decreed a moratorium on biological study of the pariah gene after early Great Crusade experiments courted disaster, reserving any further experimentation for his own direct experimentation should he wish it. He didn't destroy the gene line research. He restricted access to himself alone. That is the pattern. Now the institutions. The Sisters of Silence are among the oldest orders in the Imperium. Their formal organization dates to within the first 4 solar decades of the Great Crusade, following an event called the Cataclysm of Pentacanese, a hive world near Terra, where the existing system for managing psychers catastrophically broke down. But the Wiki also acknowledges that what became the Silent Sisterhood long dwelt in the shadows awaiting their time,
even before the Crusade, referencing a precursor group called the Hollow Ones. The origins are, in the lore's own phrasing, extremely mysterious. Every woman within the Sisters of Silence is a pariah. Every one. The Codex, Sisters of Silence, states it directly. Their immunity to psychic assault is a consequence of the pariah gene they carry within them. The composition isn't incidental. It defines the institution. The question the canon never answers is why.
The pariah gene isn't sex-linked. Necron pariahs in older canonical material were depicted as male. Cullexus assassins are drawn from pariah carriers without any gender restriction. There is no documented biological reason that the gene would produce primarily female carriers. Community forums confirm there is no official explanation for the female-only composition anywhere in the available codex material. It's simply how the sisters are, and the Imperium has never explained it. Gaps in an institution this old, this close to the Emperor, this deliberately kept mysterious, are significant. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, the sisters operated at a scale the contemporary Imperium has largely forgotten. Tens of thousands deployed across the galaxy, commanding the Black Ships, hunting rogue psychers. They deployed in force at the burning of Prospero in 004 M31 alongside the Space Wolves and the Adeptus Custodes. Their headquarters was the Somnus Citadel on Luna. Their exact numbers were unknown, save to the Emperor. Along with the Legio Custodes, they had the right to walk freely within the inner sanctum of the Imperial vaults, not the outer vaults, the Emperor's own sovereign domain. That access is unusual for an order whose founding the canon can't agree on. It's the access you would expect if the order wasn't simply a purpose-built anti-psyker institution, but something the Emperor kept proximate because he was responsible for it. Following the Horus Heresy, the sisterhood was cast out by what the lore describes as a distrustful Imperium. Many were killed. Many more were scattered. The order went dormant for approximately 1,500 years, persisting in isolated enclaves, officially disbanded after the Age of Apostasy in the 36th millennium, never quite destroyed. The gene line scattered, hidden in fragments across a broken galaxy. Then, in 999 M41, following the birth of the Great Rift, the Silent Sisterhood was reactivated under a decree called the Dispensatus Anathema. That reactivation belongs to the closing argument. First, the other institution. The Cullexus Temple is the hidden half of the pattern, one of 6 founding clades of the Officio Assassinorum, established in the 30th millennium under Malcador the Sigillite. Its founding figure is named in the Warhammer 40,000 wiki as Sire Cullexus, described as having possessed the pariah gene that made him a psychic blank, and identified as presumably the first of his kind. No further origin is provided. Where Sire Cullexus came from, how he came to the Emperor's attention, what his history was before the founding, the canon provides nothing. His origin is simply absent. The Cullexus Temple recruits exclusively from natural pariah carriers. The Codex, Officio Assassinorum, states this plainly. Potential candidates are chosen to be Cullexus assassins because they are born with an extremely rare human genetic mutation called the pariah gene. Their operational profile weaponizes that null field through the animus speculum, a battle helm that focuses and amplifies the assassin's natural null aura into directed blasts of what the Lexicanum calls negative psychic energy.
The passive suppression becomes an active assault. They are described as the most sinister and feared assassins of all the temples. In 990 M32, a cullexus named Dranos was deployed against the chaos sorcerer Xantaka, who had been conjuring demonic legions from the warp. Dranos was all but invisible to not only the ether sight of Xantaka's demon armies, but also his rubrique bodyguard. He walked through them unseen and killed Xantaka at point-blank range. Invisible to demon sight, invisible to chaos perception.
Because a null has no warp presence to detect. Almost nothing is known in Imperial databases about the Cullexus Temple's headquarters location. The Officio Assassinorum Wiki notes that all 6 temple locations are classified except the Eversource, which keeps operatives on mobile vessels. The cullexus is somewhere on Terra. That is all that is acknowledged. Now, set the 2 institutions beside each other. Sisters of Silence, visible, uniformed, large-scale, martial, Emperor proximate, operating openly under Imperial sanction. Tens of thousands deployed in formation. The public face of null capability, if such a thing can have a public face. Cullexus Temple. Hidden, individual operatives, deniable, location classified even within Imperial databases, deployed against specific high-value targets with no formation and no uniform identity. The covert instrument. Both recruit exclusively from the same genetic stock.
One condition, one rare gene. 2 institutions that couldn't be more different in their operational philosophy. The sisters are known, loudly, in the way that silence is loud. The cullexus are invisible, even to their enemies. 2 institutions, 2 strategies, 1 gene line. No canonical explanation for why the same genetic population is divided across 2 such different structures, rather than concentrated in one. That is the pattern the distribution argument calls a deliberate fracture, designed to present as 2 separate things, 2 uniforms on 1 inheritance. The strategic logic is the most difficult section to reconstruct honestly. Why distribute rather than destroy? And why distribute rather than field a Null Primarch as a unified asset? Destruction is the simplest alternative and deserves an honest assessment. A Primarch discovered to be a null during the Great Crusade could simply have been expunged.
The Emperor's default response to problems he didn't want to solve publicly was erasure. If the null sun represented a theological problem for the imperial truth, an empiricist ideology struggling to accommodate a sun who embodied the negation of the warp's reality rather than its mastery, or simply a sun whose nature was too strange to incorporate, destruction is credible. The fandom wiki notes that the Primarchs themselves were to blame for their respective disappearances, suggesting the erasures weren't simply operational convenience. Something about what they were or did prompted the response. But the destruction of the gene line specifically is harder to reconcile with the Emperor's documented strategic behavior. He kept the Webway project secret from nearly all Primarchs, describing it publicly as the great work to conceal its true purpose. Only 1 Primarch was ever told of the Chaos God's existence. Malcador confirmed this to Dorn. The Emperor placed a moratorium on pariah gene research after early experiments courted disaster, but didn't destroy the research. He restricted access to himself alone. Across domain after domain, the Emperor's pattern isn't destruction of sensitive assets, but compartmentalization and personal control of access. A Null Primarch as a single body presents a specific strategic problem. He would be the single most valuable anti-chaos asset in the galaxy, and the single most obvious target. Every dark power with any intelligence would orient its entire strategy around removing that one being. Irreplaceable, unmissable, a concentrated point of failure for the Imperium's best anti-warp capability, carrying a target painted by his own extraordinary usefulness. A null gene line distributed across two separate institutions is something different, redundant, deniable, self-propagating. Pariahs are born, not manufactured, so the gene line doesn't require ongoing intervention to continue producing carriers. And crucially, recoverable. A distributed thing, as the argument runs, can always be gathered again. To be exact about confidence here, the argument that distribution was a deliberate, strategic decision sits at 10 to 20% probability. The Emperor's long-horizon planning is canonically documented. The inference that he applied it to a null gene line is reasonable. It isn't proven. The simpler reading, two institutions independently recognizing the pariah gene's value and building around it, can't be ruled out. What the simpler reading struggles with is the specific founding timing of both institutions within the same early Crusade period as the Lost Primarchs' discovery and erasure, and the specific composition anomalies neither institution's canon has ever addressed. The cullexus founder's origin is unexplained. The sisters' female-only composition is unexplained. The Emperor's personal moratorium on pariah gene research, combined with his reservation of further experimentation for himself alone, implies a level of engagement with the gene line that goes beyond simply recognizing its utility. Three honest alternatives deserve explicit acknowledgement before the closing argument. First, the Null Primarch was genuinely destroyed, and the pariah gene's appearance in both the Sisterhood and the cullexus reflects convergent institutional development. The Emperor recognized the gene's value independently of any Primarch connection and built two separate structures around naturally occurring carriers. This requires no distribution decision and no hidden inheritance. It's consistent with every canonical fact presented. Second, the pariah gene predates any Primarch and is entirely unconnected to them. The Eldari have suggested, in older canonical material, that the Necrons engineered the pariah gene into humanity's primate ancestors millions of years ago during the War in Heaven, a biological anti-psychic weapon intended against the Old Ones and their successors. If the gene predates the Emperor's project by millions of years, it can't be a Primarch's contribution. Both the sisters and the cullexus draw from a pre-existing pool that has nothing to do with the Lost Primarchs. Third, the two institutions evolved separately and share the gene because pariah carriers are simply the most effective raw material for anti-psyker work, and two different institutional designers independently reach the same conclusion. All three are plausible. The distribution thesis survives alongside them because the forensic argument isn't that those alternatives are impossible. It's that the pattern is more specific than any of them fully accounts for. The founding timing, the Emperor's moratorium,
The institutional opacity, the warp-assisted erasure, the female-only composition that canon has never explained. None of those facts alone proves the thesis. Together, they produce a shape worth naming. Now the contemporary turn, which is the most speculative section and must be framed precisely as that. In 999 M41, the Cicatrix Maledictum tore open, the Great Rift, a galaxy-wide series of warp storms that split the Imperium in two. Imperium Sanctus, sheltered near Terra and the Astronomicon. Imperium Nihilus,
cut off from Terra's light, navigating warp exposure that makes every anti-warp asset in the Imperium's inventory more strategically critical than at any point in the previous 10 millennia. Within that same period, the Sisters of Silence were reactivated under the Dispensatus Anathema Decree. After 1,500 years of dormancy, after being cast out and officially disbanded, the Silent Sisterhood returned to open service alongside the Indomitus Crusade.
The Pariah Nexus campaign narrative involves a region of space affected by Necron anti-psychic technology, with Sisters of Silence and cullexus operatives figuring in the Imperial response. Explicit confidence level for what follows, 5 to 10%. The reconcentration argument is speculation built on top of unverified speculation. Two unconfirmed claims must both hold before this third question can even be asked. What follows is a question, not a conclusion. If the null gene line was distributed rather than destroyed, then the reactivation of the Sisters of Silence and the increased deployment of cullexus operatives following the Great Rift isn't simply institutional response to a warp emergency. It's the early stage of reassembly, a distributed thing beginning to be gathered. The Imperium may not understand what it is doing. The institutions themselves may not know what they share. The Sisters understand they carry the pariah gene. The cullexus understand they carry it.
What neither institution's documentation records, and what the canon deliberately leaves unaddressed, is where that gene came from. Who first bore it at Primarch scale? What name once belonged to the father of this silence? What happens when a distributed null gene line is reconcentrated is a question the Imperium hasn't had to answer, because for 10,000 years the two halves have operated in complete institutional separation. But the warp is now closer to real space than it has been since the heresy. The conditions that would make a concentrated null force most necessary are the conditions the era of ruin has already produced. And the pariah gene, placed under moratorium for the rest of the crusade, reserved for the Emperor's personal experimentation alone, is once again in active Imperial interest. Something is being gathered. What it becomes when it's whole, the Imperium hasn't yet had to reckon with. Return to the count. 20 Primarchs. Statues in the Imperial Palace.
10,000 years of Imperial history built around a number that is actually 18 plus 2 deliberate absences. The surviving Primarchs swore oaths of silence and kept them. Malcador told Dorn the two were lost forever and offered nothing more. The canon's most comprehensive institutional record, Betrayal, simply erases them from its accounting without comment. This reconstruction concerns the forgotten, the one whose warp absence would have assisted the most successful erasure in Imperial history, the one whose gene line couldn't produce standard Astartes because the Emperor's own psychic imprint carried in every genoseed implant would have made the pariah gene in a Primarch's genetic contribution a lethal incompatibility, the one whose biological inheritance had to go somewhere else. The others were conduits. Magnus, whose warped soul tore reality by accident. Fulgrim, whose presence drew a god's attention.
Even the loyal Primarchs were warp-connected beings, radiant in the immaterium, visible to every power that moved through it. That visibility was both value and liability, a blazing psychic address that the Great Crusade's hidden enemy could perceive from across the galaxy. One sun would have had none of that. No warp signature, no demonic interest, no address in the immaterium at all. A being the ruinous powers couldn't locate, couldn't corrupt, couldn't perceive, and whose gene line, placed in natural human carriers rather than implanted through the Emperor's psychic-infused Astartes process,
would produce individuals with the same unseeable quality. The Imperium taught you to count to 20 and to look away from the two places where the count breaks. But the gap at the 11th was never empty.
It was the exact shape of the one sun who wasn't a conduit, but a void. A living null. A being who did to the warp what no weapon the Imperium has ever built could do. Made a piece of reality that chaos can't see and can't enter. You don't destroy a thing like that. It's the single most valuable asset in the war the Emperor was actually fighting. But you can't keep it whole either. Because whole, it's a target every dark power in the galaxy will spend everything to erase. So you do the careful thing. You take the gene line apart. You put one half in an order of silent women you keep close and martial and unexplained. You put the other half in a temple of assassins you keep hidden and deniable and rare. You call one of them sister and the other one assassin, and you never, ever say the word Primarch. And you wait, because a distributed thing can always be gathered again. 10,000 years later, the Imperium is gathering. The contemporary interest in the pariah gene, the renewed value of the untouchable in a galaxy torn by the Great Rift. That isn't new science. That is reconcentration. That is the Imperium reaching back into the two boxes the Emperor hid the pieces in, and beginning, maybe without even understanding it, to reassemble an erased sun. The Null Primarch didn't die. He was distributed. And the question the Count was always hiding isn't what happened to him. It's what is the Imperium building, now that it has started putting him back together. Subscribe for more investigations like this one.